In the soft glow of an early June morning, the stately red brick facade of Kensington Palace stood quiet, embraced by silence, save for the distant rustling of trees in Hyde Park. Within its ornate, high-ceilinged chambers, a girl named Alexandrina Victoria stirred from sleep. She was not yet a queen, nor even a woman, but the weight of destiny pressed ever closer to her slender shoulders. Born on May 24, 1819, to Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, her infancy had passed not in freedom or gaiety, but under the shadow of loss and control. Her father had died when she was scarcely a year old, and so her life became a carefully regulated existence under what came to be known as the Kensington system, a strict and calculated regimen designed by her mother and her mother's confidant, Sir John Conroy. It was meant to mould her into a malleable figure, one whose thoughts and actions could be guided with subtle pressure. But in truth, it was a cage of rules and isolation. Each day began at 8:30, her petite form dressed immaculately in stiff fabrics and lace. At 9 sharp, she met with her tutors. Reverend George Davis, her religious instructor, guided her through the tenets of the Church of England, while Baroness Letzen, her deeply loyal German governess, taught her languages, literature, and how to think for herself. Letzen, stern, dutiful, and affectionately protective, became both guardian and shield. Though bound by duty, she was also Victoria's only true friend in those formative years. Victoria was not allowed to walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. She was never permitted to be alone. Every book she read, every person she spoke to, every letter she wrote was monitored. The goal, she would later write, was not her betterment, but her submission. Sir John Conroy sought power, not just influence over her mother, but dominion over Victoria herself. It was an arrangement that instilled both loneliness and quiet defiance in the young princess. In the hours between lessons, she found solace in drawing and painting. Her sketchbooks filled with images of dogs, horses, palaces, and the occasional, fanciful landscape. More than art, it was a form of rebellion, a quiet space in which she could shape a world of her own making. But it was in writing that she truly found her voice. At the age of 13, she began a journal, a habit that would endure throughout her long life, ultimately spanning over 60 years and more than 122 volumes. Her diary entries in those early years are tender and observant, filled with longing and sharp wit. She wrote of her weariness with the Kensington system, her frustrations with Sir John, and her deep appreciation for Baroness Letzen. She remarked on the beauty of the weather, the solemnity of church services, and the joy of receiving new books. Her pen, steady and precise, gave form to a young mind full of curiosity and spirit. Though surrounded by fine furnishings and regal tapestries, Victoria's world was small. Her companions were few. Her half-sister, Princess Theodora, older and recently married, visited when she could. Victoire Conroy, daughter of Sir John, was meant to be a companion, but Victoria saw her more as a spy than a friend. Thus, her truest relationships were with her journal, her governess, and her own steadfast will. And yet, beyond the palace walls, the world was changing. King William IV, her uncle, was aging and his health declining. With no legitimate heirs, Victoria was next in line to the throne. The tension in the palace grew with every passing year. Her mother and Sir John saw opportunity in the looming crown, angling to become regents should Victoria ascend before turning 18. But Victoria was more watchful than they knew. She waited quietly, counting the days until she could choose her own course. That moment came swiftly. On the morning of June 20th, 1837, as dawn broke over London, a solemn knock echoed through Kensington Palace. Lord Conyngham and the Archbishop of Canterbury had come to deliver the news. The king was dead, and she, barely 18, was now Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The first thing she did, with quiet dignity, was ask to be alone. That single request signaled the end of an era. From that day forth, she would be her own woman. Her first act as monarch was to reject the presence of Sir John Conroy from her household. She moved her bed out of her mother's room and established a separate household within the palace. With Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister, she formed a deep friendship, one that provided political mentorship and personal reassurance during those uncertain early months. Her days, once filled with rote lessons and silent supervision, were now occupied by meetings with ministers, signing documents, reading dispatches, and studying matters of state. She approached it with the same diligence that had defined her childhood. Her evenings, no longer lonely, were spent attending the opera or receiving guests. Though shy by nature, she began to find her voice not only in writing but in speech. Yet even as she navigated court life and royal duty, another thought grew in her heart. Love, marriage, partnership. She thought often of her cousin, Prince Albert, of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, whose quiet intellect and artistic sensitivity had struck a chord in her when they last met. What began as youthful admiration was beginning to take root as something deeper, a connection that would shape the very fabric of her reign. This, then, was the dawn of Queen Victoria, not merely a transition from girlhood to queenship, but the quiet blossoming of a soul long restrained. No longer watched at every turn, she began to breathe deeply and act decisively. Her diary on that day reflected the enormity of her feelings. "Since it has pleased Providence to place me in this station," she wrote, "I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country." And so began the reign of a monarch and the awakening of a woman. The hush of early morning gave way to a more bustling rhythm as Queen Victoria, newly ascended, took her place within the halls of Buckingham Palace, a home she would make her own over time. Though the walls echoed with grandeur, this young monarch was only beginning to understand the intricacies of her role. The crown, while heavy with symbolism, did not come with a manual. Instead, it offered duties, endless, layered, and unforgiving. Each day began not with leisure, but with diligence. Victoria was an early riser, attending to state papers at her writing desk, where sunlight streamed through velvet-draped windows. Her handwriting, precise and elegant, graced official letters, royal decrees, and personal notes. She reviewed reports from her ministers, consulted with secretaries, and met regularly with Lord Melbourne, whose calm demeanour and seasoned counsel proved invaluable. Lord Melbourne was more than a political mentor. He became a source of steadiness, a kind presence amidst the overwhelming demands of court life. She once described him in her diary as kind and good, praise not lightly given. He walked her through matters of parliament, military affairs, and the balancing act between monarchy and government. Though she held power, she was not absolute, and Melbourne helped her learn when to wield influence and when to offer restraint. The court itself was an intricate stage. Nobles, courtiers, and advisers orbited the young queen, their mannered bows and measured words often concealing deeper agendas. Victoria, though young, learned swiftly. She read eyes as keenly as she read documents, noting who flattered out of sincerity and who did so from ambition. There were countless rituals, levées and audiences, ceremonies and suppers, all carefully orchestrated to maintain royal presence. Some she found enchanting, others exhausting. At the weekly drawing rooms, she greeted ladies of the realm dressed in silk and lace, their curtsies precise, their conversation practiced. At formal dinners, the clink of crystal and rustle of satin surrounded her, but so too did the subtle tensions of hierarchy. Though she was their queen, she remained a young woman amidst a court dominated by men older, wealthier, and more seasoned in courtly games. Whispers of doubt accompanied her wherever she went. Was she too naive, too emotional, too dependent on Lord Melbourne? Such murmurs pricked at her pride, yet she bore them with outward composure, retreating only to her diary, where her thoughts flowed freely. Evenings brought a welcome shift. Victoria adored music and the arts. She attended operas by Bellini, concerts of Mendelssohn, and theatrical performances at Drury Lane. The artistry stirred her soul, offering respite from the politics of the day. In her private quarters, she often sketched or played the piano, sometimes joined by Letzen, whose presence remained a familiar comfort. One evening, as candles flickered low in the drawing room, Lord Melbourne spoke to her of governance and marriage, two domains that, in his mind, should remain separate for now. He counselled patience, yet Victoria's thoughts strayed often to Prince Albert. Though still abroad in Germany, his memory lingered, his earnest gaze, his quiet strength, his love of music and philosophy. Letters travelled across the Channel, carefully, worded, proper in tone, yet rich with the quiet affection of two souls beginning to align. She reread them by firelight, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Court whispers tried to guess her intentions, but she remained tight-lipped, knowing that any public misstep would be seized upon by the press and the Parliament alike. Victoria's independence continued to blossom in small, determined ways. She chose her own ladies-in-waiting, favouring those who respected her privacy and offered candid companionship. She resisted efforts to pressure her into appointing advisers she distrusted. Her relationship with her mother remained cool and formal. Though they now shared the palace, they lived almost entirely apart. Sir John Conroy, whose influence once loomed large, was now far from court, dismissed and disgraced, by her own command. These were not the grand acts of a seasoned monarch, but the steady choices of a young woman discovering her authority. They shaped the queen she would become. Her people began to take notice. The press, often merciless, began to change its tone. They described her as diligent, honest, and graceful. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates to catch a glimpse of her carriage. When she appeared in public, at St. James's Park, in Hyde Park, or along the Thames, she was met with cheers, not out of obligation, but genuine affection. And yet, beneath the crown and court, Victoria remained a woman of deep feeling. Her emotions, though tempered in public, ran strong in private. She wept over sentimental novels, mourned the passing of family pets, and kept locks of her father's hair, sealed in envelopes. She was sentimental, romantic, and fiercely loyal to those she loved. She was also keenly aware that love, in her position, was never merely personal. It was also political. Her court became a place where music and conversation, duty and desire, power and gentleness all coexisted. She walked its corridors with increasing confidence, her steps echoing with quiet determination. Still, she longed for companionship, not the deferential presence of courtiers, but the true partnership of an equal. That longing grew with each passing day, and in the soft hours of evening, as she sat by candlelight, rereading Prince Albert's latest letter, her heart stirred with a certainty she could no longer deny. Love was coming, but with it would come change, not just for Victoria the woman, but for Victoria the Queen. The season had turned to autumn, and with it came a golden hush over the gardens of Windsor Castle. The trees wore their final finery, amber, ochre, and crimson, and the air carried the scent of falling leaves. Queen Victoria, now comfortably settled into the rhythms of sovereign life, paced slowly beneath the boughs of an ancient oak, thoughts as full as the clouds above. Her mind was not on state matters, nor on the expectations of court, but on a singular name that filled the pages of her diary more often than she cared to admit: Albert. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was her cousin. Yes, but their bond transcended bloodlines. Their first meeting, arranged when she was just 17, had left an impression no time could erase. He had arrived with his brother Ernest, both stiffly dressed and formally mannered, but it was Albert who lingered, in her thoughts. He had not spoken much, but when he did, it was with earnestness and thoughtfulness that stirred something within her. Over the years, their connection had continued through letters, carefully composed in English and German, often discussing music, politics, and faith. Albert was a thinker, a reader of Goethe and Schiller, a devotee of Bach and Handel. And yet, it was not only his intellect that captured her. It was his gentleness, his deep eyes, and his quiet strength. He was unlike any man in her court, and she found herself dreaming of what might be. In early October of 1839, the long-awaited visit came. Albert, now 20 years of age, returned to England at her invitation. His carriage arrived at Windsor on a mist-veiled morning, and Victoria, unable to contain her anticipation, watched from her window with her heart thudding like a drum. He emerged, taller and more assured than before, his dark coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. Their reunion was warm, if formal, an embrace not of lovers but of distant companions suddenly aware that something had changed. Over the days that followed, they took long walks together, attended chamber concerts in the music room, and dined in the soft candlelight of royal chambers. Victoria noticed the quiet way he observed everything, the paintings, the servants, the sky. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he revealed a thoughtful man beneath the polished manners. He asked her questions about her reign, her hopes, her fears, questions few others dared to ask. He did not flatter, he did not cajole, he simply saw her. It was this, his unerring steadiness, that moved her. She had spent her life surrounded by men who wanted something from her, power, proximity, or prestige. But Albert wanted nothing but truth. And so, on the morning of October 15th, she did what no reigning queen had done before. She proposed to him. It was a private moment in the Blue Room at Windsor. Victoria, dressed in a simple white morning gown, clasped her hands nervously as Albert entered. She dismissed her attendants with a nod and motioned for him to sit. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then she spoke, her voice soft, but unwavering. "I believe," she said, "that we understand each other well, and I hope, deeply, that you feel as I do, that we, together, might be strong where we are vulnerable and gentle where we are strong." Albert's eyes met hers, wide with surprise, but filled with unmistakable affection. He stood, crossed the room, and took her hand in both of his. "Victoria," he replied, in a voice low and tender, "nothing in this world would make me more proud than to be your husband." There were tears then, gentle and joyful, not of sorrow but of immense relief. For in that moment, the future unfolded, like a blooming rose, full of promise, full of complexity, full of love. The news, though not made public immediately, stirred the inner court. Whispers turned to celebrations. The engagement was formally announced weeks later, and preparations for a royal wedding began. Yet Victoria was insistent on one thing. This would not be a union of strategy, but of the heart. She began to write of him constantly in her diary. "My dearest Albert," she penned one evening, "is so sensible, so kind, so good, so amiable, and so handsome. I love him more than I can say." Still, there were challenges ahead. Albert was a foreign prince, and the British press, though enamoured with romance, bristled at the idea of a German consort. Parliament debated what title he would hold, what allowance he would receive, and what role he might play in the affairs of the realm. Victoria fought quietly but fiercely on his behalf, demanding that he be treated with dignity and respect. She was no longer merely the monarch. She was now a woman in love, and with that love came a steely new resolve. She confided to Lord Melbourne that while she would never abandon her duties, she would not let the world deny her happiness. Their wedding was set for February 10th, 1840. As the date approached, Victoria oversaw every detail, from the musicians to the floral arrangements. She chose to wear white, a rare and daring choice, signalling purity and a break from tradition. Her gown, crafted from Spitalfield silk and Honiton lace, would later set the standard for bridal wear for generations. The days passed in a blur of fittings, rehearsals, and anticipation. Yet, in the quiet hours of twilight, when the corridors of the palace fell still, she would sit alone at her writing desk, rereading Albert's letters. Her heart, once guarded, now beat boldly. This marriage would be unlike any other in modern monarchy. Not a mere alliance, but a partnership of minds and hearts. It would shape not only her life, but the very legacy of her reign. And as winter settled over London and the bells of Westminster prepared to ring, Queen Victoria stood at the threshold of something grander than crown or country. She stood at the threshold of love. The morning of February 10th, 1840, dawned pale and quiet, as if the very sky was holding its breath. A hush blanketed the cobblestone streets of London, though the city was already stirring with anticipation. Chimneys puffed gentle streams of smoke into the wintry air, and gas lamps flickered out as daylight crept in. In every window, portraits of the Queen had been pinned, and from the bakers' carts to the palace gates, people whispered of the day to come, the wedding of Queen Victoria to Prince Albert. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was a blend of solemnity and celebration. Footmen bustled with polished shoes and velvet coats, while ladies in waiting moved like whispers through gilded halls. In her private chamber, Victoria stood before a grand mirror, wrapped in the quiet awe of what was about to unfold. Around her, seamstresses and attendants made final adjustments to her gown, a vision in white satin, trimmed with rich lace from Honiton and held at the waist by a simple orange blossom wreath, symbol of purity and eternal love. The decision to wear white had been hers alone, an unorthodox choice that was met with both admiration and murmurs of surprise. Traditionally, royal brides wore opulent colours, silvers, golds, or even crimson. But Victoria sought something different. She wished not to dazzle as a sovereign, but to arrive as a woman in love. A sapphire brooch, a gift from Albert, was fastened delicately at her throat. Her veil, sheer and long, shimmered faintly in the lamplight. When the preparations were done, the Queen sat for a moment in silence, clutching a small handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Her heart, though resolute, fluttered like a bird at the edge of a vast sky. The royal carriages departed just after 11, making their way slowly toward the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Crowds lined the procession route, despite the February chill, waving flags and cheering as the Queen passed by. Her face, framed by lace and curls, beamed through the carriage window, nervous yet radiant, youthful yet sovereign. St. James's Chapel, adorned with lilies and ivy, glowed with candlelight. The scent of wax and winter flowers filled the vaulted space. Dignitaries, lords, ladies, and foreign envoys sat in solemn expectation, their breath visible in the cold chapel air. Prince Albert, awaiting his bride, stood beneath the chancel arch in a crimson British Field Marshal's uniform. Gold braid traced his cuffs, and his chest bore the star of the Order of the Garter. Though composed, his eyes flicked often to the great wooden doors, listening for the first notes of the Queen's arrival. And then it began. The organs swelled, deep and harmonious, as the choir began, "Come, Holy Ghost." Victoria entered, leaning on the arm of her beloved uncle, the Duke of Sussex. The chapel fell into hushed reverence. Every step she took seemed etched into memory, the way her veil floated behind her, how her gaze met Albert's with a shy, soft joy. There was no need for words between them in that moment. All that needed to be said was carried in their eyes. The ceremony itself was brief and deeply solemn. The Archbishop of Canterbury presided, his voice echoing through the chamber as vows were exchanged. Victoria's hand trembled slightly in Albert's, but her voice held firm. When the rings were placed, hers of Welsh gold, his simple and unadorned, it was as though two lives merged before the eyes of heaven and history. "I, Victoria, take thee, Albert." Those words, spoken so clearly, rang through the minds of those in attendance. Here was not just a queen joining with a consort, but a woman joining with her beloved, freely, fiercely, and forever. The final blessing was given, the register signed, and a fanfare erupted as they turned to face the world as husband and wife. The cheers outside the chapel thundered as the doors opened once more. London rang with bells and joy. Petals rained from balconies. Even the grey clouds seemed to lift, as if giving way to sunlight in celebration. The wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace was grand yet intimate. The Queen and Prince Albert sat side by side at a long oak table adorned with white roses and silver candelabras. The court toasted with champagne, and soft music drifted from a small orchestra tucked near the marble hearth. Though surrounded by ceremony, Victoria kept her hand gently atop Albert's, as though to remind herself that it was all real. Later that afternoon, they stole away from the grandeur, retreating to Windsor Castle for a brief honeymoon. The journey was cold and quiet, but they scarcely noticed. In the carriage, Victoria rested her head against his shoulder, eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips. For the first time in her life, she was not under scrutiny, nor study, nor surveillance. She was simply a wife in the presence of her husband. The honeymoon days were sweet and simple. They walked in the woods, read poetry aloud, and exchanged small, affectionate notes left on pillows or tucked into books. She recorded everything in her journal: his smile at breakfast, the way he looked at the stars, how he brushed a leaf from her hair during a walk, and in the quiet of night, behind thick drapes and beside a glowing fire, they whispered promises that no public document would ever record. Promises of faith, of companionship, and of enduring love. Though history would speak of this marriage in terms of dynasties and royal houses, for Victoria, it was never about thrones or treaties. It was about Albert. It was about the man who had seen her for who she was, long before the crown had found its way to her brow. And thus began the next chapter, not only of a monarchy, but of a union that would define her reign and inspire generations. In the gentle light of a March morning, Queen Victoria awoke beside her husband for the first time, not just as a sovereign, but as a wife. The chambers of Windsor Castle, though still hushed and stately, now held a warmth they had not known before. Prince Albert, her consort, no longer a guest or suitor, was part of her life in the most complete sense. Their shared days had begun, and with them came a new kind of sovereignty, one shaped by love, partnership, and the subtle choreography of two minds learning to govern together. Though Victoria was queen by law and lineage, Albert was the silent engine behind much of her evolving reign. His role was not carved clearly by tradition. In the annals of British monarchy, there had been queens and their husbands before, but few, if any, who would share so deeply in the fabric of governance. For Albert, this ambiguity was both blessing and burden. He approached his new life with the same precision and discipline that had defined his education in Coburg. Early each morning, before the palace stirred, he reviewed economic reports, agricultural, journals, and letters from foreign ambassadors. Though he had no formal authority, his counsel began to shape Victoria's thinking in quiet, consistent ways. Victoria, ever candid in her journals, wrote of his influence with pride. "He is so clever, so good, and so gifted," she recorded one spring evening, "and I am proud to lean on his strength." Their conversations over breakfast ranged from domestic policy to scientific innovation. Albert's interests were vast: industry, architecture, education, sanitation. He saw the potential for Britain to be not only powerful, but enlightened. And while Victoria tended to favour tradition, she found herself drawn into his vision. At court, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Ministers began to note Albert's presence beside the Queen at meetings, his quiet questions, his notations in the margins of state papers. Some resisted. Lord Melbourne, ever loyal to Victoria, harboured doubts about this growing influence. But even he could not deny Albert's intellect or the calm clarity he brought to debate. Still, public sentiment was not immediately warm. The British press viewed the Prince Consort with suspicion. He was foreign, German, untested. He spoke with a slight accent. He did not hunt foxes. He seemed more at home in libraries than in drawing rooms. The people whispered, would he meddle in English affairs? Would he try to rule behind the throne? Victoria, fiercely protective, bristled at such rumours. She made it clear, both in private and in Parliament, that Albert was her confidant, her counsellor, and her closest ally. In a letter to her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, she wrote, "He is everything to me, my husband, my guide, my support." The palace, once a place of stiff tradition, began to reflect the couple's shared values. Albert introduced reforms, behind the scenes, more efficient accounting, stricter schedules, and an emphasis on moral responsibility. Servants were treated with greater respect. Waste was curtailed. Even the furnishings took on a more modest, refined elegance. Their personal life, too, began to bloom within these walls. In late spring of 1840, Victoria discovered she was with child. The news, while expected, filled her with a strange blend of joy and apprehension. She had always been told that childbearing was the woman's solemn duty, but it was also a realm unknown to her. She confided in Albert, who held her hand and listened patiently to her worries. "You are not alone in this," he told her. "We will face every joy and every fear together." As her belly grew, so too did the sense of change. Her public duties shifted slightly. She no longer rode as often in state processions, and long audiences became shorter. But she remained engaged, continuing to read dispatches and meet with ministers from the quiet comfort of her sitting room. Albert, meanwhile, stepped further into the role of palace steward. He began drafting speeches for her review, meeting with architects about new public projects, and even organizing the royal household's ledgers. While he never signed a single law, his fingerprints were increasingly present in the day-to-day running of the monarchy. To those who looked only at formal titles, Albert was merely a consort. But in truth, he was her second self. Where she was passionate, he was measured. Where she was instinctive, he was analytical. They were, as she once described, one heart and one mind. The challenges of rulership did not disappear with their union, but they were now born together. Foreign affairs in Europe were tense. Revolutions simmered in France and Prussia. Irish discontent flickered in the background. The Chartist movement called for sweeping reforms to suffrage and labour. But through it all, the Queen and her prince stood united. On warm evenings, after the burdens of the day had been set aside, they would walk together in the palace gardens. Albert spoke often of education, of building museums and schools, of improving sanitation in the cities. Victoria, who once found such topics tedious, now listened with genuine interest. Her arm looped through his. They dreamed aloud beneath the stars, not just of palaces and parades, but of a country that could be wise as well as grand. When Parliament voted in 1840 to deny Albert the title of King Consort, Victoria was furious, but Albert, ever modest, waved away her indignation. "Titles matter less than trust," he told her. "Let our legacy be built on what we do, not what we are called." And so it was. Their reign, still young, still forming, was beginning to take on a shape not seen before. It was a shared crown, not in law, but in spirit. A kingdom ruled by two hearts in harmony. The autumn of 1840 came gently, as if nature herself was softening the world in preparation for a moment of great significance. Trees turned golden in the parks around Buckingham Palace, and the wind carried with it the scent of wood smoke and rain. But within the palace walls, all attention was drawn not to the colours of leaves nor the shifting skies, but to a single room where Queen Victoria, now visibly pregnant, awaited the arrival of her first child. It had been months since she first noticed the subtle signs, the nausea in the mornings, the fatigue that slowed her brisk walks through the gardens. At first, she had felt uneasy, even resentful. Her body, once so active and unburdened, now moved with unfamiliar heaviness. And yet, as the days passed, a new awareness settled over her. She was not simply a queen, nor merely a wife. She was about to become a mother. Prince Albert, ever attentive, became her shadow and her strength. He read aloud to her from books of philosophy and poetry, helped her walk through the palace when her legs ached, and even took to studying medical texts in secret, hoping to understand what she might endure. Though childbirth was a queen's duty, it remained a mysterious and perilous path. He could not join her on that journey, but he vowed to walk as near as he could. On the evening of November 20th, 1840, labour began. The palace, ordinarily a place of order and routine, moved suddenly with quiet urgency. Midwives were summoned. Physicians stood waiting. The halls grew hushed as candlelight flickered behind drawn curtains. Outside, London carried on, largely unaware that the future of the monarchy was entering the world behind those tall stone walls. The labour was long and wearying. Victoria cried out not only from pain, but from the weight of expectation, of centuries of queens who had borne heirs under the gaze of court and country. Yet in that room, in that moment, she was no sovereign. She was simply a woman in the agony of bringing forth life. Albert remained nearby, pacing outside the chamber door, his face pale and drawn. Time moved slowly for him, each hour stretched by helplessness. At last, near midnight, the door creaked open, and the doctor appeared, with a soft, triumphant smile. "It is a girl, Your Royal Highness," he said. Victoria lay in bed, exhausted but relieved. A warm bundle was placed in her arms, a child with tufts of brown hair and tightly shut eyes. The Queen looked down and wept, not with disappointment at the gender, as some expected, but with the raw, profound awe of a mother meeting her child for the first time. The infant was named Victoria Adelaide Mary Louise, a name that carried echoes of mothers and monarchs before her. She would become known to history as Victoria, Princess Royal. The news spread quickly. Bells rang out across the capital, and gun salutes thundered from the tower. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, singing and waving flags. Though some had hoped for a male heir, most were simply delighted at the promise of continuity, of the royal line secured by a daughter born in peace. Inside the palace, new rhythms took hold. A nursery was prepared in the upper chambers, complete, with French wallpaper and English lace. A rocking cradle of polished mahogany stood near the fireplace, and a nanny was chosen with the utmost care. Victoria insisted on being involved in every detail. No swaddling too tight, no perfumed linens, and visits at all hours to hold her daughter close. Still, her duties as queen called her back, and with time, she resumed audiences and correspondence, even as her heart remained tethered to the nursery. She found herself writing late into the night, pausing only to listen for the faint cries of the child sleeping just above her. Albert, meanwhile, took to fatherhood with quiet devotion. He delighted in holding the baby in the early mornings, singing to her in soft German lullabies that filled the chamber like drifting clouds. He insisted that she be raised not only with love, but with reason, that even a princess should know the value of thought and kindness. Their home, once formal and cold, now pulsed with a new energy. Laughter echoed in the hallways, and the scent of warm milk and lavender filled the air. The Queen and her prince, who had shared their throne, now shared this sacred task of nurturing life. And yet, even in the joy of new parenthood, there were whispers from beyond the palace gates. Parliament resumed its debates. Chartists marched, again in protest, demanding reform and representation. Across the Channel, France watched England's affairs with wary interest. The world, ever turning, did not wait for mothers or monarchs to rest. Victoria, though tender in private, remained sharp in public. She resumed her appearances with renewed strength, her eyes alight with a fiercer resolve. She now ruled not just for herself or her people, but for the child whose future depended on the choices she made. The months passed, and the princess grew quickly. Her first smile, her first tooth, her first unsteady step, each was recorded in Victoria's diary with maternal pride. "She is the light of our days," she wrote one evening, and the proof that love, when true, gives not only comfort, but continuation. Their family would not end with one child. Indeed, in time, there would be many. But it was this first child, this delicate daughter born of both crown and devotion, who transformed their union from companionship into legacy. In the golden nursery of Buckingham Palace, where lullabies mingled with the distant toll of bells, the Queen held her child close. Outside, the Empire waited. Inside, for a moment, time stood still. The early days of motherhood brought with them a sweetness unlike anything Queen Victoria had known before. Yet, as with all things human and divine, that sweetness was accompanied by shadows. Being both mother and monarch required a delicate balance, a tightrope strung between the demands of the crown and the cries of the nursery. And for Victoria, young still in years and new in every sense to the realm of motherhood, the balancing act would test the very fibres of her resolve. Her daughter, Princess Victoria, now called the Princess Royal, grew steadily in both health and spirit. Her laughter brightened the nursery, her tiny fingers wrapped instinctively around the Queen's own, and in the quiet hours of dawn, when only the cooing of pigeons broke the stillness, mother and child shared moments of pure, unspeakable tenderness. It was then that Victoria most felt her humanity, fragile, luminous, and entirely apart from statecraft or ceremony. Yet, almost as swiftly as the bond had formed, the demands of royal life began to reclaim her hours. The courtiers returned, dispatches piled upon her desk, letters from foreign ministers, petitions from Parliament, and memoranda from Albert awaited her signature and review. The Empire, sprawling and ever hungry, did not pause for the comforts of infancy. The Queen could not, as other mothers might, linger by her child's crib until morning. She could not hold her daughter through sleepless nights or accompany her on every stroll through the gardens. This divide pained her. In her diaries, she confessed her unease. "I love my darling child," she wrote, "but my heart aches with the pressure of all I must be." It was not a lack of affection, but a burden of duality, the expectation that she would be as present in matters of war and law as she was in lullabies and kisses. Albert, more reserved but equally tender, took on a greater share of parenting. He rose early to feed the child and played with her in the quiet drawing room. He monitored the nursery staff and ensured that she would grow not pampered, but educated. Victoria, watching him, felt both gratitude and a peculiar pang of guilt. In a world governed by male inheritance and female propriety, it was rare, even unspoken, for a father to be so intimately involved. Yet Albert not only embraced this role, he seemed to flourish in it. His quiet companionship with the Princess Royal became one of the palace's most heartwarming sights. Father and daughter in the garden, he showing her how to hold a flower without bruising its petals. But still, doubts lingered within the Queen. Society watched her with a careful eye. The press alternated between praising her maternal instincts and critiquing her absences. Some papers hinted that a queen could not be both strong and soft, ruler and mother. In Parliament, conservative voices questioned her decisions, whispering of feminine weakness, though always behind closed doors. The Queen, wounded yet proud, pressed on. She increased the number of hours she spent at council, recommitted herself to state correspondence, and reviewed military reports with steely precision. She refused to let her role be diminished by motherhood, but nor would she allow motherhood to be diminished by her role. Yet this refusal led to weariness, emotional, physical, spiritual. She began to suffer headaches and long bouts of melancholy. Some days, the sheer weight of expectation left her quiet and distant. On others, she would lose her temper over minor affairs, only to retreat in sorrow once the storm had passed. It was during this time that Albert quietly arranged for her to spend more hours in the countryside. He encouraged visits to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, a seaside retreat where the Queen could rest among roses and sea air, far from the pressing corridors of London. It was there, walking the pebble-strewn beaches or sitting beneath elm trees with her daughter in her lap, that Victoria found something like peace. She would draw in her sketchbook as the child played beside her, or hum German lullabies her mother had once sung. The Queen wrote that nature became her refuge, a cathedral without walls. But the world beyond the waves was changing still. Ireland faced starvation. India trembled beneath colonial friction. The young Queen, though surrounded by silks and roses, knew that her empire was not at ease, and she knew that, inevitably, more children would come. Indeed, by the spring of 1841, she was once again with child. The news, while not unexpected, brought a fresh wave of emotion. Joy, certainly, but also dread. The first birth had been painful, the recovery long, and the adjustment difficult. She wondered, would she again be forced to divide her soul in two, to place the needs of crown and country before her arms could cradle her newborn? Albert, as ever, was her anchor. He reminded her gently and without arrogance that to bear children was not to weaken, but to extend love into future generations. Our family, he said, is not separate from your reign. It is the soul of it. Those words stayed with her. In time, they would guide her through many more births, 9 in all, and through the changing tides of both her family and her kingdom. But in that moment, under the soft sky of Osborne, Queen Victoria sat in the grass with her daughters, curls brushing against her shoulder and her hand resting protectively upon her belly. She was tired, yes. She was uncertain. But she was also deeply, utterly human. And that, perhaps more than any proclamation or parade, would shape the kind of queen she became. In the latter months of 1845, as London bustled with the preoccupations of an empire, expanding trade, courtly events, and the hum of industry, darker clouds gathered to the west, over the Emerald Isle of Ireland. For centuries, a land of poets and warriors, of haunting ballads and mist-covered hills, Ireland now trembled under the weight of hunger. At Buckingham Palace, Queen Victoria received the first reports in tidy envelopes, missives from lords and clergymen, detailing failed harvests and murmurs of unrest. The potato crop, the backbone of Irish sustenance, had begun to rot in the earth. At first, it seemed an unfortunate, though isolated, blight. But soon the reports grew in number and gravity. The rot spread faster than anyone imagined. In drawing, rooms and parliament halls, terms like phytophthora infestans were spoken with unfamiliar tongues. But in the cottages of Connaught, Munster and Ulster, the crisis was not botanical. It was personal. Families awoke to fields blackened with disease. Where once green rose had promised nourishment, now there was decay, a stench like death itself. Victoria was deeply moved by the letters she received. Accounts of barefoot children begging in market towns, of fathers walking 10 miles for a single loaf, of mothers boiling nettles and seaweed to feed their kin. Though she had never set foot on Irish soil, the Queen felt a stirring in her conscience. She began to ask questions, more than her ministers expected. What was being done? Who was leading the relief? Could more be sent? Her sympathy was genuine, though her distance from the suffering proved problematic. The machinery of government moved slowly, entangled in bureaucracy and economic ideology. Influential figures within her cabinet believed in laissez-faire policies, that interference in the natural market would do more harm than good. They saw the famine as tragic, yes, but not as a royal responsibility. They feared encouraging dependency. Victoria, though not versed in economic theory, found such reasoning cold. She pressed for action. In early 1846, she personally donated $2,000 to Irish relief, an enormous sum at the time, nearly a third of her private annual income. She wrote letters of encouragement to charitable organisations and even arranged for a day of national fast and prayer for Ireland's deliverance. Yet the scale of suffering outstripped every effort. By the spring of 1847, the famine had deepened. An estimated 1 million Irish men, women, and children were starving. The ports of Cork and Dublin became swollen with emaciated families, hoping for passage to England or America. Makeshift workhouses overflowed. Disease took what hunger had not. The Queen's husband, Prince Albert, shared her concern. He urged more modern means of support, advocating for infrastructure projects that might employ the destitute and rebuild Ireland's rural economy. But political resistance remained strong. Some in Parliament believed the Irish should learn moral improvement before aid would be truly effective, a sentiment rooted less in governance than in prejudice. Victoria grew quietly furious. Her journal, usually a place of personal reflections, began to bear notes of her dissatisfaction. "Why is help withheld?" she scrawled one night. "Can no one see they are our people too?" She wanted to go to Ireland herself, to see the truth behind the reports. But she was advised strongly against it, told it would be unsafe, inappropriate, even inflammatory. A monarch, they said, could not walk through famine-stricken villages without consequence. Her presence might incite unrest, or worse, become a target. So she remained in London, heart tethered to a suffering land she could not touch. She read poetry by Thomas Moore and letters from Irish priests. She sent more funds in secret through charitable intermediaries. She asked Albert to speak more often of Ireland in his addresses. In the drawing rooms of her palace, Irish guests were invited and honoured, particularly those who advocated for their people through dignity and diplomacy. But such gestures, however sincere, could not reverse the tide. As the months wore on, the Queen's household received word of more deaths. Friends of noble families lost, estates emptied of tenants, children buried in unmarked graves. The famine became not just a crisis, but a wound in the heart of the empire. In 1849, 4 years after the famine began, Queen Victoria finally visited Ireland. It was not a relief mission, but a ceremonial visit, meant to express unity and strengthen ties. The people, though divided in sentiment, came to see her. In Cork and Dublin, crowds gathered to cheer, not always out of loyalty, but often out of hope. She was greeted with flowers, harpists, and children waving handmade flags. She saw the beauty of the land firsthand, the green hills, the vast skies, the dignity in the faces of those who had endured, and she also saw the absence. Empty cottages, famine graves, landscapes scarred by survival. It moved her more than any letter ever had. Back in England, she pressed her ministers harder. She insisted that Ireland not be forgotten, even as recovery slowly began. Her diaries from that year are among her most sombre. "I have seen a land beautiful and wounded," she wrote. "We must not let silence fall where sorrow has lived." The legacy of the famine would follow her reign, its memory echoing in the halls of Westminster and the hearts of generations. Some would call her efforts too little, too late. Others would recognize her compassion, stifled by a system too slow and prideful to act. History would debate her role, but in the quiet of her own heart, Victoria knew this truth. She had wept for Ireland, and she would never forget it. The corridors of Buckingham Palace, once echoing only with the polite footsteps of courtiers and the soft murmur of ministers, began to resound with new, brighter notes, those of children's laughter and hurried footsteps. As the 1840s gave way to a new decade, Queen Victoria found herself not only at the helm of a mighty empire, but at the centre of a growing, vibrant household. Her family, once a dream and a future hope, now unfolded around her in the form of tiny hands, sleepy eyes, and the occasional shriek of youthful rebellion. After the birth of her first daughter, the Princess Royal, the Queen soon welcomed her second child, Albert Edward, born in November of 1841. He would one day inherit the crown as Edward VII, though in those early years he was simply Bertie, a curious and sometimes troublesome little boy with a strong will and an unruly mop of golden hair. Motherhood, as it turned out, was not something Victoria took to effortlessly. She loved her children, there was never any doubt of that, but she often struggled with the sheer physical and emotional demands of raising them. She had been raised herself in a strict, regimented fashion, and she was wary of indulgence. "I am not a brooding hen," she once wrote with dry humour, frustrated after days spent managing toddler tantrums and nursery ailments. Still, the children came one by one, each bearing their own temperament, their own charm, and their own small rebellions. Princess Alice arrived in 1843, followed by Prince Alfred in 1844. Then Helena in 1846, Louise in 1848, Arthur in 1850, Leopold in 1853, and finally Beatrice in 1857. 9 children in all, each a branch upon the growing tree of the House of Windsor, each a challenge and a wonder to their devoted, if occasionally exasperated mother. With each new child, the nursery expanded. Rooms were redecorated with soft linens and colourful prints. Nurses, tutors, governesses, and nannies moved into the palace like a quiet army, ensuring that every hour of the children's day was accounted for, structured, and filled with suitable pursuits. Prince Albert oversaw much of their education, especially the boys, whom he believed should be raised with a balance of intellect and discipline. He introduced them to geography, languages, science, and the classics, believing in the moral power of learning. Victoria, for her part, was often torn. She longed to be a warm, affectionate mother, yet she found herself drawn away again and again by the demands of monarchy. There were state councils, audiences, ceremonies, and the ever-pressing mountain of correspondence. Sometimes, after long days of duty, she would steal into the nursery to watch the younger children sleep, overwhelmed with a mix of guilt and tenderness. Her relationship with each child developed differently. With the Princess Royal, she shared a kindred spirit, intelligent, perceptive, and precocious. But Bertie, the heir, challenged her in ways she had not expected. He was slow to learn, more interested in horses and games than in books. Victoria, comparing him unfavourably to his father's rigour and seriousness, feared he might never be ready to rule. Her disappointment sometimes surfaced in cutting remarks, which wounded him deeply and strained their bond. Still, amidst the strains, the Queen delighted in moments of levity. She described in her letters how little Alfred once ran into a formal dinner wearing only a lace petticoat, or how Louise would sit for hours painting birds with a concentration that belied her age. At Osborne House, their seaside retreat, the family could leave behind the rigid formality of court life. There, Victoria could be not a queen, but simply Mama, reading fairy tales by the fire, walking barefoot with the children along the beach, or watching the boys chase kites through the spring green fields. Albert, ever industrious, designed Swiss-style chalets on the Osborne grounds so the children might learn domestic tasks and enjoy the practical pleasures of life. He wanted them to grow as whole people, not simply heirs and princesses, but thoughtful citizens of the world. The Queen, though amused at times by his seriousness, admired his vision and supported him in nearly all things. Yet behind their expanding family lay a quiet tension. The Queen's pregnancies, though spaced with care, were taxing on her body and spirit. She suffered from postnatal depressions, then unspoken, unnamed, and at times confessed in her journals to feeling overwhelmed by the chaos and repetition of motherhood. "I feel more like a worn-out machine than a woman," she wrote after the birth of her 7th child. She also feared the pain of loss. With each birth, she became more aware of the dangers, not only of childbirth itself, but of illness, of childhood mortality, of the countless shadows that could steal away what she loved most. This fear grew sharper as illness moved through the palace from time to time. Scarlet fever, measles, influenza. Each cough, each fevered forehead filled her with dread. But even in those anxious hours, the Queen found solace in her husband's steady hand. Albert, who had once feared his own inadequacy as a father, now moved with quiet authority through the halls of their home, soothing the children with lullabies or overseeing their lessons with gentle rigor. His love for his family became the living testament of his character, a daily devotion that never wavered. By the early 1850s, the royal family had become a symbol of domestic virtue to the people of Britain. Paintings of the Queen and her children, arranged like any middle-class family around the hearth or garden, were widely circulated. The public, seeing these images, began to feel a personal kinship with the monarchy, not distant rulers of abstract power, but a family much like their own, filled with squabbles, laughter, and love. For Victoria, the journey was far from perfect. She made mistakes, felt regrets, and battled exhaustion. But she also nurtured life, gave warmth, and cherished the small, sacred joys of a child's kiss, a shared smile, a lullaby hummed in the quiet of night. Her family was not only her legacy, it was her sanctuary, the place where the weight of the crown, if only for a moment, could be set aside. It was a vision born not in a royal hall, but at a quiet writing desk in Windsor, a vision shaped by the meticulous hands and luminous mind of Prince Albert. He had long dreamed of something grand, something noble, something that would show the world not the might of Britain through conquest or empire, but through invention, progress, and peace. And in 1851, that vision would take form in glass and iron, rising like a modern cathedral in the heart of London, the Crystal Palace. The great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations was to be the first of its kind, a gathering of the finest minds, crafts, and innovations the world had to offer. It would celebrate not only Britain's industrial supremacy, but the collaborative genius of humankind. For Albert, who had long championed science, design, and education, this was more than a display. It was a statement of belief in the future. Queen Victoria supported the endeavour with quiet but steady enthusiasm. Though she had not conceived of the exhibition herself, she recognised its potential to unite a rapidly changing world. More than that, she understood what it meant to Albert. This was his grand project, his offering to the nation and to the centuries that would follow. She lent it her name, her influence, and most of all, her presence. The planning began in earnest. A committee was formed, exhibitors contacted, architects consulted. It was decided that the exhibition would be held in Hyde Park, at the very centre of London's social and political life. But what building could possibly contain such ambition? Enter Joseph Paxton, a gardener turned engineer, who proposed something radical, a vast structure of prefabricated iron and glass, modelled on his experience with greenhouses. It would be transparent, open, flooded with natural light, and built with astonishing speed. Albert, with his eye for innovation, immediately saw the brilliance in it. Victoria, when shown the first sketches, declared it a fairy palace. Construction began in 1850, and by spring of the following year, the Crystal Palace was complete. 1,851 feet long, 408 feet wide, with soaring glass ceilings and endless rows of exhibits. Inside, more than 100,000 objects from across the globe were displayed. Textiles from India, porcelain from China, typewriters from America, and steam engines from Britain. The air was thick with the scent of cedar wood, machine oil, and polished brass. May 1st, 1851, dawned clear and bright. A hush fell over London, not of silence, but of anticipation. Crowds had begun gathering at the gates of Hyde Park before dawn, dressed in their finest clothes, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Queen and her family. Victoria awoke early, her gown, of pale blue silk, laid out beside her. She dressed with care, assisted by her ladies-in-waiting, and ensured that her children were ready too. Albert, ever composed, wore a dark suit and the insignia of the Order of the Garter. Together, they stepped into their carriage and made their way toward the glass colossus that now stood like a dream on English soil. When they arrived, a great cheer went up from the assembled crowds. Inside, the exhibition buzzed with light and movement. Foreign dignitaries, scientists, artists, and schoolchildren moved like streams of color beneath the shimmering roof. Victoria held Albert's arm tightly, her heart swelling with emotion. This was not just a royal appearance. This was a moment of shared pride and purpose. She recorded her thoughts in her journal that evening, writing, "This day is one of the greatest and most glorious in our lives. It is a day which makes my heart swell with thankfulness." The park presented a wonderful spectacle. Crowds streaming through it, the multitude of carriages, the troops, the different bands playing, the tremendous cheering, the joy expressed in every face. As the royal procession passed through the central nave, the Queen marveled at the exhibits. There were diamonds from South Africa, printing presses from Germany, hand-woven tapestries from France, and a full-sized fountain carved entirely of pink glass. The air was filled with music, the harmonies of choirs, and the low hum of excited conversation. But more than the wonders of the world, what moved Victoria most was the spirit of the moment. Here was peace, not in name alone, but in practice. Nations that had once fought bitter wars now stood side by side, offering their best to one another in the spirit of unity. It was a vision of what the world could be, and for one fleeting season, it became real. Albert, for all his brilliance, remained humble. He walked the halls quietly, observing not only the machines but the people, how they spoke, what caught their attention, how they reacted. His satisfaction was quiet, but profound. "This is not merely an exhibition," he told Victoria that evening. "It is a mirror of civilization." The success of the Great Exhibition was immediate and overwhelming. Millions attended over the following months. The British public, once skeptical, hailed it as a triumph. Foreign guests sent gifts of appreciation, and the profits from the event were used to establish institutions of learning and culture, what would later become the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Science Museum in South Kensington. Victoria, though modest, in claiming credit, was deeply proud. She had seen how the world viewed Britain, not as conqueror, but as a beacon of invention and intellect. She had seen her husband rise to greatness, not by title, but by vision. And she had seen the common people, from factory workers to schoolgirls, walk beneath the glittering ceiling of the Crystal Palace, with heads held high. Years later, the Queen would still speak of that day with wonder. It was not just a celebration of industry, it was a celebration of hope, of what nations could accomplish when imagination was given wings and peace was given space to breathe. As the cheers from the Great Exhibition slowly faded into memory, Queen Victoria found herself standing at the edge of something much vaster, more complex, and infinitely heavier: the weight of empire. The shimmering glass of the Crystal Palace had shown the world Britain's greatness, but it had also, in quieter ways, revealed its reach, its entanglements, its contradictions, and its costs. The British Empire now spanned continents, from the snowy reaches of Canada to the goldfields of Australia, from the bustling ports of the West Indies to the teeming plains of India. The sun quite literally never set upon Victoria's dominions. It was a phrase that stirred pride in many hearts, but with each new colony came new responsibilities, new tensions, and new sorrows. Victoria, in her grand palaces and peaceful gardens, lived far from the hardships endured on distant frontiers. And yet, as sovereign, she bore the symbolic crown over it all. Her mornings were now filled with dispatches not only from Parliament, but from governors, viceroys, and commanders scattered across the globe. She read of rebellions in Ceylon, famines in India, and tribal unrest in southern Africa. She read of missionaries, traders, and soldiers, some triumphant, others lost to disease, to war, to isolation. She had been raised to believe in duty, and so, with her characteristic resolve, she applied herself to empire with the same diligence she had once given to language lessons and state papers. She questioned ministers about India's tax reforms, sent letters of congratulations to colonial governors, and asked Albert's advice on the administration of Hong Kong. She paid careful attention to the details of foreign service and land, charters, attempting, as best she could, to be a queen to lands she would never see. Yet the deeper she read, the more she sensed the cracks beneath the grandeur. India, jewel of the crown, loomed large in both fascination and unease. In portraits and palace rooms, Victoria admired its silks, its spices, its intricately carved furniture. She wore cashmere shawls and read translations of Sanskrit epics. But beneath this romantic veneer lay a churning unrest. British administrators often ruled with arrogance, ignoring local customs and sacred traditions. The annexation of princely states bred resentment. Religious tensions simmered dangerously, as did resentment over land seizures and tax burdens. Victoria did not always grasp the nuances of Indian society, but she sensed its pain. When the Sepoy Rebellion, also called the Indian Mutiny, broke out in 1857, she was shocked. Reports flooded in of British families murdered in their sleep, of native soldiers rising up in fury, of entire towns consumed by chaos. The public was outraged. The press called for vengeance. But Victoria's response was measured. She mourned. The British dead deeply, yes, but she also demanded that reprisals be limited, that cruelty not be answered with cruelty. In a letter to her ministers, she wrote, "We are rulers of millions who look to us not only for power, but for justice." After the rebellion was quelled, she personally approved the decision to dissolve the East India Company and bring India under direct control of the Crown. It was an enormous shift, one that made her, formally, the sovereign over more than 200 million people. She asked for translations of Indian laws. She commissioned a special edition of the Bible in Urdu. She began corresponding with Indian scholars and even appointed Indian servants to her household. In time, she would form a lifelong friendship with Abdul Karim, a young Indian clerk who would teach her Urdu and introduce her to Indian culture in ways no governor ever had. But all this lay ahead. In the 1850s, her understanding of empire remained conflicted, admiring yet uneasy, proud yet concerned. In Africa too, the imperial project was expanding. British settlers moved into the Cape Colony and Natal. Missionaries journeyed deep into the interior, writing back tales of hardship and conversion. The Queen received gifts from tribal leaders, ivory tusks, spears, and ornate beadwork. She admired them, curious and respectful, but she also sensed the tension behind the tokens. Reports from the colonies painted Africa as wild and untamed. But Victoria, even from afar, felt the tug of complexity. She supported the abolition of slavery and funded charities that aided freed slaves in Sierra Leone and Liberia. When missionaries wrote to her about the abuses they had seen, she listened, asked questions, and pressed her ministers to investigate. Still, the contradictions were stark. British soldiers enforced treaties that favoured trade over justice. Local leaders were often displaced. In her private moments, the Queen wondered whether the empire's reach had outgrown its grasp. Albert, always more analytical, shared her concerns. He urged greater investment in education for colonial subjects, better sanitation, and reform of exploitative labour systems. He believed empire could be a force for good, but only if it was governed with wisdom and humility. Victoria, caught between the romance of empire and its grim realities, walked a careful line. She believed in the civilizing mission of Britain, but she also felt the sting of human suffering. She loved the empire's pageantry, the regimental uniforms, the music, the flags, but she did not turn a blind eye to its burdens. In portraits, from this period, she appears regal and serene, yet her eyes carry a depth that speaks of knowledge earned not from textbooks, but from letters inked in sorrow, hope, and fire. By the end of the decade, the empire had grown larger than even her, most ambitious ministers had imagined, and so too had the shadow it cast. Across oceans, across peoples, across the conscience of a queen. The year was 1861, and the winds over Windsor grew still, as if the very breath of the palace had faltered. Queen Victoria, once the young monarch so full of ardour and ambition, now stood cloaked in shadows deeper than any the crown had ever cast. For in the heart of her home, and at the very centre of her soul, She was about to lose the one thing she had never ruled, but always adored. Prince Albert, her beloved husband, her consort, her second self. The signs had been subtle at first. Albert had grown quiet, more weary, and seemed to retreat ever so gently from the bustle of court life. He complained of pains, of sleeplessness, of a heaviness he could not shake. The doctors, unsure, speculated it was exhaustion, perhaps depression, brought on by overwork and the strain of his tireless duties. He had thrown himself into every corner of state and family, reforming institutions, educating the royal children, handling diplomatic affairs, and shielding Victoria from many of the kingdom's darker burdens. But as the months passed, his condition worsened. He grew paler, thinner, and increasingly frail. In December, he took to his bed in Windsor Castle, surrounded by candlelight and the whispers of concerned physicians. Victoria, alarmed yet clinging to hope, sat at his side for long hours, holding his hand, brushing back his hair, and speaking to him in the soft German endearments they had always shared. She had never imagined a life without him, from the very moment she had proposed to him. So many years ago, Albert had been her axis. He was her partner in governance, her advisor in politics, her fellow parent, and her dearest friend. They had shared secrets, frustrations, joys, and dreams. He had taught her patience, and she had taught him passion. Their union had never been without tension, but it had always been marked by profound and unwavering devotion. On December 14th, 1861, just after 10 o'clock in the evening, Prince Albert drew his final breath. The room was still. A clock ticked, softly in the background. Outside, the December frost clung to the windows. Victoria wept, not with the wails of dramatic grief, but with the deep, aching stillness of a heart that had been pierced in silence. She kissed his brow, whispered his name, and then sat unmoving for what felt like hours. The world would remember Prince Albert as a visionary, a reformer, the man behind the Great Exhibition and 1,000 quiet improvements in British society. But to Victoria, he was simply my darling, my all. She called him that in her journals again and again, as though the words themselves might anchor her to what she had lost. She dressed in black that very night, and from that day forward, she would never again wear colour. Black gowns, black veils, black gloves. Mourning was no longer a period of time, but a permanent state of being. She withdrew from court life almost entirely. Public appearances ceased. State events were conducted through letters or emissaries. Even the brightness of Osborne House and the splendour of Balmoral seemed dim without his presence. The Queen was broken. Her children, grieving in their own ways, struggled to reach her. Bertie, now the heir, was met with her coldness, perhaps a projection of blame, for Albert had worried himself deeply over Bertie's youthful indiscretions just before falling ill. The Princess Royal, now married and living in Prussia, wrote tearful letters, begging her mother to take comfort in their love. The younger children tiptoed through the palace halls, missing their father and bewildered by their mother's unreachable sadness. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. Victoria kept Albert's rooms precisely as he had left them. His clothes were laid out each morning, his shaving brush still wet, his letters still atop his writing desk. She wrote to him in her diary, as if he were only away, not gone, confiding her loneliness, her fears, her memories. I sit alone, she wrote, and long for the sound of his voice, his step in the corridor, his dear hand in mine. It was not only a queen who mourned, but a woman who had lost her truest companion. And yet, even in the depths of sorrow, the machinery of monarchy could not stop entirely. Ministers came and went, papers were signed, matters debated. Slowly, Victoria resumed some of her royal duties, though she delegated many of them. She preferred to stay at Balmoral or Osborne, far from London, where reminders of her former life haunted every street and hall. Public sentiment, initially sympathetic, began to shift. Newspapers questioned her prolonged seclusion. Some even, accused her of abandoning her people. But others understood that here was not a monarch shirking duty, but a human heart shattered under the pressure of public and personal loss. It would be years before Victoria would resume her place in full, but when she did, she would return not as the hopeful young queen of the early reign, but as the widow sovereign, clothed in black, her face lined with grief, yet her will sharpened into something fierce and enduring. Albert's death marked a profound transformation, not only in the Queen, but in the monarchy itself. It ended the most intimate partnership of royal governance the country had ever known. From this point forward, Victoria would rule alone, but she would carry him with her always, in photographs upon her desk, in memorial statues across the realm, and in the quiet, eternal companionship of memory. She once wrote, in a letter to her daughter, "My life as a happy woman is over, but as a queen, I will still do my duty, for he would have wanted it so." And so she did. In the years that followed the death of Prince Albert, the world saw Queen Victoria not as a reigning monarch in the traditional sense, but as a shadow, an austere, veiled figure known across the empire as the Widow of Windsor. It was not a title she had claimed, yet it suited her grief, her presence, and her transformation. Where once she had smiled for the public, attended galas, and trotted on horseback through the parks of London, now she receded from view, cloaked in mourning and solitude. Windsor Castle, perched above the River Thames, became her preferred sanctuary. The towering battlements, the ancient stone, the view across green lawns and quiet woods, these gave her some semblance of peace, or at least silence. She found comfort in routine, morning prayers, long walks, careful readings of the days, dispatches, and, always, time spent writing in her journal to Albert, as if her pen might reach across the veil that separated them. Though removed from court life, Victoria was not idle. She remained in daily contact with her ministers, responding to letters and signing state documents. But her appearances were rare. She declined invitations to parliament openings, coronation anniversaries, and foreign royal events. Even Christmases at Osborne were muted affairs, drapes drawn, music hushed. Laughter, if heard, felt out of place. To the public, her withdrawal became a puzzle. In the newspapers, her absence sparked frustration. How could a queen, beloved, admired, powerful, vanish from the very people whose lives she touched? Political. Cartoonists began to sketch her as a ghostly silhouette. Parliament debated the optics of her reclusiveness. Some whispered that she had surrendered to sorrow, but those who knew her more intimately saw the truth. This was not abdication, but endurance. Victoria had not abandoned her post. She had simply found a new way to bear its weight. For a woman who had lost her heart's companion, every act of rule now required double the effort and came laced with melancholy. Her very handwriting changed, more angular, more precise. Her tone in letters became both sharper and more personal. She had always been willful, but now her grief had refined her will into steel. And then, into the stillness of her mourning, came a man who would stir the quiet. His name was John Brown, a Scottish servant from Balmoral, formerly assigned to Prince Albert, and later made responsible for managing the Queen's horses and outdoor excursions. He was blunt, loyal, and unafraid of the Queen's silence. Where others tiptoed around her sorrow, Brown addressed her plainly. "Come, Your Majesty," he would say, "the hills won't climb themselves." At first, she was taken aback by his familiarity, but in time, she found it oddly comforting. He did not treat her as fragile. He did not pity her. He brought her shawls when the wind bit her cheeks and scolded her when she refused to eat. He became her escort on walks through the Scottish glens, her companion at fireside dinners, her staunch protector. Rumours blossomed, of course. The press dubbed him her Highland servant. Some even whispered of marriage, though no proof was ever offered. What mattered most was this: Brown gave the Queen back her breath. Through him, she reconnected with the world in slow, steady increments. She resumed trips to Balmoral and Osborne, She began writing again, not just diaries, but volumes of reflections on Albert, on motherhood, on the burdens of monarchy. She even returned to public appearances, though never with the frequency of her youth. In these years, her attire remained unchanged: deep black dresses, lace-trimmed mourning veils, simple pearl jewelry. She looked every inch the matriarch of sorrow. Yet beneath the somber surface, there burned a quiet intensity. Her presence grew more mythic, more powerful in absence than it had ever been in constant visibility. Internationally, her image shifted, from that of a queen regnant to an empress matriarch, a moral pillar in an age of upheaval. She received dignitaries with a calm that spoke of endurance. She offered condolences to bereaved families, especially widows, with the empathy only one who had suffered deeply could give. In 1876, Disraeli, her favourite prime minister of the era, officially declared her Empress of India. It was both a political move and a symbolic recognition that Victoria, now well into her later years, had become more than sovereign. She was legacy. Still, behind the grandeur, she remained deeply human. She missed Albert every day, his voice, his laughter, his corrections and counsel. She often spoke of him to her children as though he had merely gone on a long journey. His portrait hung in every room she occupied. His writing desk remained untouched. On his birthday, she lit a candle at dawn. On their anniversary, she wore the brooch he had gifted her and sat alone for hours, looking out the windows at Windsor's Long Walk. She leaned more heavily on her daughters, particularly Princess Beatrice, the youngest, who became both caretaker and confidant. Bertie, now grown and increasingly prominent as Prince of Wales, still failed to win her full approval. She saw in him too much of what Albert had feared: frivolity, distraction, a taste for pleasure over purpose. And yet, he too mourned in his own way, and did his best to fill the void left by the father he had struggled to please. The Queen aged with grace, if not joy. Her cheeks thinned, her steps slowed, but her eyes remained sharp and her judgment steady. When asked about her long mourning, she once replied, "Grief is not a weakness. It is the cost of deep love." And so she continued, ever veiled, ever steady, the widow of Windsor, a symbol of constancy in an era of change. By the 1880s, Queen Victoria had become something more than a sovereign. She was a symbol, a fixture, a living embodiment of continuity in a world changing faster than many could comprehend. Now well into her 60s, she had reigned for over 4 decades. The girl who had once clutched her mother's hand at Kensington now ruled over the most far-reaching empire the world had ever seen, not by conquest alone, but by longevity, by presence, and by a quiet, enduring will. This was the era her ministers came to call her golden years of influence. Though still draped in the black of mourning, Victoria moved with more command than ever before. Her grief had not diminished. It had simply taken new shape. No longer a cage, but a cloak. Her black garments became less a statement of sadness and more of solemn majesty. She wore them like armor, and in them she was revered. No longer expected to ride horseback or dazzle at balls, her strength lay now in wisdom and in the power of her word. Her meetings with prime ministers, now more seasoned than deferential, revealed a sovereign who knew the country's political mood better than some of the elected men who served it. From Disraeli to Gladstone, from Salisbury to Rosebery, she was both muse and measure. While the government handled day-to-day decisions, they always looked toward Windsor or Balmoral for the Queen's blessing, or her subtle displeasure. In truth, she wielded her influence through presence and persona, rather than policy. She rarely interfered directly in legislation, but her voice could amplify a cause. Her silence could still a debate, and when she chose to speak, for the poor, for widows, for military families, her words carried the gravity of a nation's mother. And the nation, for its part, responded with unprecedented affection. Victoria's golden image adorned coins, stamps, and portraiture in homes and public buildings across the empire. In schoolrooms, children learned not just dates and battles, but the virtues of the Queen herself: devotion, modesty, perseverance. Across the oceans, colonists in India, Australia, and Canada toasted her name during jubilees. In Africa, missionaries and tribal leaders alike spoke of her with both awe and admiration. She had become more than monarch. She was grandmother to an empire. Her own grandchildren, numbering in the dozens, scattered across Europe like living tendrils of her legacy. Through her children's strategic marriages, Victoria became matriarch of a royal web that linked England to Germany, Russia, Greece, Norway, Romania, and beyond. It was said there was scarcely a throne in Europe untouched by her bloodline, and she followed their lives closely, writing letters, advising on marriages, fretting over political turbulence in foreign courts. She maintained especially close bonds with Wilhelm of Prussia, her grandson, later known as Kaiser Wilhelm II, and with her beloved granddaughter, Princess Alex, who would one day marry into the doomed Russian dynasty. These relationships gave her joy, but also moments of worry. The world of royalty, once so tightly knit, was beginning to fray at the edges. Nationalism was rising, old alliances cracked. She saw it coming in quiet glimpses, the tension beneath diplomatic smiles, the uneasy letters from distant capitals, and still, she believed in peace. Victoria had lived through wars: Crimea, India, the Zulu conflict, and the skirmishes of empire. But she dreaded the idea of a great European conflict. She prayed that the bonds of family, forged through marriage and tradition, might hold back the tides of destruction. In her quiet moments, she wrote of these hopes in her diary, as she once had written to Albert: "Let blood protect blood. Let history not repeat its sorrow." Beyond diplomacy, her influence was deeply felt in domestic society. Though never a radical reformer, she lent subtle support to social progress. She admired Florence Nightingale's efforts in nursing and even wrote personally to her after the Crimean War. She supported the extension of education, improvements in sanitation, and modest steps toward expanding the rights of women, though she remained privately skeptical of the suffrage movement. She believed that women's power lay in moral authority, not ballots. "A queen may govern," she once remarked, "but she must do so with grace and firmness, not with the rage of men." At home, she remained surrounded by a close circle of trusted aides and family members. Her relationship with John Brown had ended with his death in 1883, a loss that left her once again quietly bereft. Yet in time, another figure emerged: Abdul Karim, an Indian servant who would become her munshi, teacher, companion, and friend. Their friendship, though controversial among the court, rekindled in Victoria a connection to India that she treasured. He taught her Urdu, shared stories of his homeland, and treated her not only as monarch, but as human. Through him, she deepened her knowledge of the very empire she ruled. She insisted he be treated with respect, raised in rank, and granted privileges, usually reserved for aristocracy. For this, she was criticized, sometimes harshly, but as always, she held her course. In these golden years, Queen Victoria had grown into a monarch unlike any before her. She ruled not by youthful charisma nor by martial triumph, but by longevity, wisdom, and a kind of stubborn, steady devotion. Her name had come to mean more than a person. It signified an age, a spirit, a way of being, and though she still ended each day with thoughts of Albert, his image always near, his memory alive in every candlelit prayer, she also looked outward, now, toward the world she had shaped. There was still much to be done. It was the summer of 1897, and the empire was awash in celebration. Union Jacks fluttered from every post. Cathedrals rang with jubilant bells. Streets were swept and garlanded, and across the vast reaches of Britain's domains, from Canada to Ceylon, from Gibraltar to the Gold Coast, the same words were spoken with reverence and wonder: the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. 60 years had passed since Queen Victoria ascended the throne, a girl of 18, trembling with the enormity of rule. Now, aged 78, she sat upon a throne, not only as sovereign of Britain, but as Empress of India, matriarch of a dozen royal houses, and the living symbol of an age defined by her reign. Never before had a British monarch reached such a milestone. It was more than a royal anniversary. It was a moment for history to pause and breathe. The preparations began months in advance. Parliament voted to fund the event with enthusiasm. Towns and cities organised local festivities. Churches composed special services. Schools taught lessons on the Queen's long reign. Children practiced choral performances and flag-waving routines. Every corner of the kingdom seemed to rise to the occasion. And yet, in the midst of this nationwide excitement, Victoria herself approached the day with measured solemnity. She was not one for vanity or excess. The thought of parades and cheers stirred more weariness than delight. But she understood what it meant. Not for her, but for her people. The Jubilee was not a celebration of her life alone, but of endurance, unity, and identity. So she agreed. On June 22, 1897, Jubilee Day, London awoke beneath a clear blue sky. The city had transformed into a vast, living stage. Crowds camped along the route of the royal procession before dawn. Some slept on rooftops, others climbed trees, and thousands more lined the pavements. Flags of every colony and dominion waved in the breeze, and the smell of flowers, horses, and summer dust filled the air. Victoria dressed early, in a gown of black silk with silver embroidery, mourning still, but touched with majesty. Her white bonnet was adorned with a diamond-studded veil, and upon her breast she wore the insignia of her empire. Age had curved her back and slowed her step, but her gaze was still keen, her presence still commanding. She could no longer ride on horseback, so her carriage, an open landau, was prepared with care. Escorted by cavalry and surrounded by loyal guards, she emerged from Buckingham Palace to a roar that rippled like thunder across the city. Children threw petals. Veterans saluted. Choirs burst into hymns as the carriage moved slowly through the great thoroughfares of London. Down the Mall they rode, past St. James's Palace, through Trafalgar Square, along the Strand, and to St. Paul's Cathedral, where a service of thanksgiving was held beneath the open sky. The cathedral steps were draped in crimson, and choirs in white robes stood in solemn rows. Too frail to climb the steps, the Queen remained in her carriage as the Archbishop offered prayers. A hush fell over the multitude as hymns rose through the warm summer air. Even the birds seemed to still their wings. The Queen bowed her head, silent, composed, moved beyond words. From there, the procession wound back through the heart of the capital, where nearly 3 million people had gathered. Among them were representatives from every colony, ambassadors from Europe, Indian princes in silks and jewels, Canadian mounties in scarlet, African kings, and Maori chieftains. The empire had gathered not in conquest, but in homage. And still, the Queen waved. Her arm, once so strong, moved with effort, but she did not stop. She looked into faces, old and young, rich and poor, native and foreign, and saw not subjects, but people whose lives had threaded through her own. She thought of Albert, of course. How he would have loved this, she whispered to her lady-in-waiting. How proud he would have been. When the carriage returned to the palace gates, the cheers surged once more. But this time, they were not for a queen alone. They were for an era. Victoria stood on the balcony, steadied by her cane, as wave after wave of admiration swept toward her. The sun glinted on the glass rooftops. The crowd sang, "God Save the Queen," in a 1,000-part harmony. That night, fireworks lit the skies across the empire. Beacons blazed on mountain tops. Ships illuminated their rigging in the harbours of Bombay, Cape Town, Sydney, and Halifax. In village squares and royal residences alike, toasts were raised to the Queen who had reigned over 2 generations and watched the world change beyond imagining. And Victoria, ever constant, returned to her journal that night. June 22nd, 1897. A most glorious day, one never to be forgotten, a never to be equaled tribute. The whole empire seemed to be there. God has been very good to me. The Diamond Jubilee was not merely a national event, it was the very embodiment of the Victorian spirit. Industrial, progress tempered by tradition, empire cloaked in ceremony, loyalty expressed through grand, quiet acts. For her subjects, she was not simply a sovereign. She was a comfort, a memory, a continuity that had endured revolutions, wars, inventions, and heartbreak. For many, she was the only monarch they had ever known, and for Victoria, the Jubilee was not a victory lap, but a mirror. In those crowds, in that music, in those flags, she saw what her life had become, woven into millions of others, carried, beyond palaces and portraits, etched into history not by command, but by constancy. As the 19th century neared its quiet conclusion, Queen Victoria, now in the twilight of her life, entered a chapter marked by reflection, gentleness, and slow withdrawal. The Diamond Jubilee had crowned her legacy in sunlight and splendor, but what followed was a slower rhythm, a reign no longer defined by expansion or ceremony, but by memory, stillness, and the long dusk of an extraordinary life. Victoria's health, though remarkably preserved through her 70s, began to decline. The stiffness in her joints grew more pronounced. Her walks, once brisk and determined, turned into carriage rides or slow, assisted strolls through the rose gardens of Windsor and Osborne. Her hearing weakened, her eyesight dimmed. Yet her mind remained sharp, even piercing. She continued to read state documents, though fewer each day. She dictated letters, replied to dignitaries, and held private audiences with trusted ministers. She no longer travelled abroad, nor presided over grand events. But within the walls of her palaces, her presence remained steady, a source of comfort to courtiers and countrymen alike. Her very image, now aged, solemn, unshakable, had become an emblem of a century. Much of her time was spent at Osborne House, her beloved seaside retreat on the Isle of Wight. There, in a modest chamber with a window overlooking the Solent, she surrounded herself with the memories that had accompanied her through life. Portraits of her children, busts of Albert, and flowers from loyal subjects filled the room. The sea breeze drifted through the curtains, and the distant sound of gulls and bells from ships gave her the illusion of eternal calm. She wrote often, though now her diary entries were shorter, sometimes no more than a line or two. The sea was very blue today, she might note. Or, a letter from Wilhelm, he writes with such pride. These fragments, like pearls strung in silence, carried the weight of a lifetime. Her family, now spread across Europe, remained in close contact. Her children visited as often as they could. Beatrice, her youngest, was ever at her side. Faithful, gentle, tireless. Bertie, now in his late 50s, stood in readiness to take on the mantle of kingship, though the Queen still held firm to her responsibilities. She had long feared he might lack the seriousness Albert would have wanted in a sovereign, but time and age had softened her judgment. She had come, if not to fully embrace, then at least to accept him for who he was. Her grandchildren visited too, Wilhelm, now the German Emperor, Alex, Empress of Russia, and countless others from Scandinavia to the Balkans. They came with kisses, letters, and tokens of affection. She received them warmly, offering them quiet counsel, bits of family history, and the blessing of her long gaze, eyes that had seen so much and still sought to see more. She followed politics with less fervour, though not without interest. She kept abreast of the Boer War, the movements of Parliament, the growing complexities of colonial governance. She had lived through the invention of the railway, the telephone, the electric light. She had seen slavery abolished, women begin to demand their voice, and a world grow simultaneously closer and more divided. And through it all, she never ceased to mourn. Albert's name remained on her lips, his memory forever close. His bedroom at Windsor was still maintained. His portraits, lined the hallways. His advice echoed in her mind when ministers came with questions. What would he have thought, she would ask. What would he have done? John Brown, too, long gone now, remained part of her private devotion. A portrait of him stood near her writing desk, along with a lock of his hair. Abdul Karim, though dismissed in her final years amid courtly resentment, had opened for her a deeper sense of the empire's diversity, a view of India not as colony, but as culture. As the century turned and the world crossed into the year 1900, Victoria was 90 years old. The world called her grandmother of Europe, but in truth, she was something even greater, the living link between the Georgian past and the electric present. People spoke her name with reverence. Schoolchildren knew the dates of her birth and coronation by heart. Elders spoke of her time as a golden age. For many, she was not just a queen, she was the century itself. And still, the years moved on. In the winter of 1900 to 1901, her health began to fail in earnest. She tired easily. Her appetite diminished. Her speech slowed. Those closest to her began to whisper that the end, long postponed, was now near. Doctors attended daily. Clergy stood nearby. Her family gathered quietly at Osborne. Victoria herself felt it coming. She did not fear death. She spoke of it calmly, with the acceptance of one who had given her all and loved fiercely. She asked that her funeral be simple, that white, not black, be worn. She made arrangements for the placement of certain objects: Albert's dressing gown, a plaster cast of his hand, letters from her children, and on the evening of January 22nd, 1901, as twilight fell upon the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria took her final breath. She died surrounded by those she loved, her children, grandchildren, and loyal attendants. The room was silent, save for the gentle lapping of sea against stone and the faint murmur of wind in the trees. Her reign had lasted 63 years and 7 months. When the news spread, bells tolled across Britain and beyond. Flags were lowered. Cities fell into quiet mourning. People who had never known another monarch felt the strange stillness of history closing a door. But Victoria, in her final years, had already ensured that her legacy would endure, not only in buildings or statues or treaties, but in the hearts of those who remembered her strength, her sorrow, her steadiness. The Queen was dead, but the age she had shaped would live on, long after her crown was laid to rest. The morning of January 23rd, 1901, dawned shrouded in stillness across Britain. From the grey rooftops of London to the heathered highlands of Scotland, from the factories of Manchester to the harbours of Bombay, a strange hush settled. Church bells tolled at measured intervals. Shop shutters remained closed. Flags hung limp at half-mast. Newspapers bore solemn headlines in black. The Queen is dead. For many, the words felt impossible. Victoria had been there for so long, for generations, for all memory. She had outlived her contemporaries, her adversaries, even many of her own children. Her name was the age itself. And now, suddenly, she belonged to the past. At Osborne House, the Queen's body lay in state in the Blue Room. It was a chamber she had loved, filled with simple furniture, floral curtains, and the scent of salt from the nearby sea. The same bed where she had once lain with Albert now held her in eternal stillness. Her face, though pale and worn, bore an expression of peace, as if she had only gone into a deeper slumber. Her children gathered in private vigil. Beatrice, the faithful daughter, wept quietly, stroking the Queen's veiled hand. Bertie, now King Edward VII, stood by the window, his expression a complex mix of grief and responsibility. He had waited so long for this moment, though never with eagerness. The crown, long postponed, now pressed firmly upon his brow. The words were spoken that morning in hushed voices across palaces and parliaments. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. Edward's ascension marked the end of an era and the beginning of something uncertain. The age of Victoria had been defined by restraint, mourning, and moral gravitas. Edward, with his continental tastes, expansive social circles, and fondness for the pleasures of life, would usher in a new chapter, one less austere, more glittering, and already whispered about in elite salons as Edwardian. But before any coronation could unfold, the country turned toward mourning. Victoria's funeral was to be both state and personal, an event of unprecedented scope. She had left specific instructions: no black horses, no all-black uniforms, and no pall of oppressive gloom. Instead, she wished for white drapery, light regalia, and the presence of soldiers, not as symbols of power, but of duty, as her body was transported from Osborne to the mainland. Crowds gathered in silence along the roads and shores. The coffin, draped in the royal standard and adorned with white flowers, was borne upon a gun carriage. Soldiers from across the empire stood at attention. Veterans, some stooped with age, saluted with trembling hands. When the procession reached London, it became a river of humanity. More than 500,000 people lined the route. Some watched in silence, others wiped tears. Many had brought their children, telling them, "You will never see her like again." The final service was held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, a place tied to generations of royal memory. Inside the medieval walls, torches flickered against stained glass. Choirs sang softly. The air was thick with incense and reverence. Heads of state from around the globe had arrived to pay homage: Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, King Alfonso of Spain. It was the largest gathering of royalty in history, and yet all bowed before the coffin of a small white-haired woman who had once ruled over them in some form or another. At the Queen's request, her funeral was a military affair. She had been, in her words, a soldier's daughter, a soldier's wife, and a soldier's widow. As the final hymn rose and the coffin was lowered into the royal vault beside Prince Albert, a volley of salutes rang out into the cold air. The bugle call echoed through the chapel. A long silence followed, broken only by the quiet sob of a child in the gallery. The Queen was at last at rest. But for those she left behind, her people, her family, her nation, the world had shifted. On its axis, the sun, which had never set on her empire, now seemed a little dimmer. King Edward VII moved swiftly to establish his role. He brought with him a new energy, opening the court to more public engagement, promoting arts and diplomacy, and distancing the monarchy from the strict moral codes of his mother's era. Yet, for all his reform, he remained deeply respectful of her legacy. He maintained her residences, upheld her charitable commitments, and preserved the institutions she had cherished. He often spoke of her not just as a monarch, but as a force, a mother of nations. Though he had spent most of his life in her shadow, he did not resent her memory. He honored it, even as he stepped into his own light. The country, too, adapted with care. Victoria's statues rose in parks and city squares across Britain and the Empire. Her name was etched into buildings, bridges, and ships. The Victoria Cross remained the highest military honor. Schoolchildren recited her dates, 1819 to 1901, with reverence. Elderly women wore black armbands for a year. Families placed portraits of the late Queen beside their hearths. Even abroad, the mourning was profound. In India, processions of elephants bore her image through flower-strewn streets. In Canada, a day of silence was observed from coast to coast. In Africa, villages named children after her. The world remembered not just a queen, but the length, the gravity, and the peculiar grace of her reign. And so, while her body lay in Windsor, her legacy travelled on, through time, through space, through stories passed from generation to generation. She had once written, in a moment of private doubt, "Will they remember me, Albert? Will it all fade like fog?" But she need not have feared. Victoria lived not only in history books, but in the hearts of those who called her their queen. And, even more so, their constant. The curtains had drawn on Victoria's life, but the echoes of her reign, faint at first, then resounding, continued to ripple through the early years of the 20th century, like the final chords of a grand and solemn symphony. Though her body had been laid to rest in the quiet of Windsor, her spirit lingered, woven into the fabric of a world she had helped shape, define, and in many ways, hold together. To say the Victorian era ended with her death would be a conclusion, but not entirely true. The institutions she had steered, the values she had championed, and the image she had cultivated did not vanish with the tolling of the funeral bell. Rather, they became embedded in the collective conscience of a people who had grown up under her gaze. There was, across Britain and the Empire, a period of adjustment that felt like walking through a house after the matriarch had passed, her presence still palpable in every room, her voice echoing in the choices made long after she was gone. In London, the great clock at Westminster ticked on, marking the hours of a new reign under Edward VII. Yet each chime seemed to carry the afternote of his mother's time. The city had changed beneath her watch, its soot-darkened skyline now pierced with spires of iron and glass, its streets alive with the sounds of carriages, telephones, and factory whistles. The world she had ruled was modern now, but born of Victorian bones. The Queen's image, once seen in every drawing room and village schoolhouse, remained ever present. Her likeness endured in statues, seated, standing, solemn, crafted in stone and bronze, and placed in every major city of the realm. In Cape Town, Victoria raised her sceptre above Table Bay. In Melbourne, she overlooked the gardens. In Delhi, her effigy still watched from beneath colonial arches. Each figure spoke not just of royalty, but of permanence, a visual assurance that some things would not be lost to time. In literature, too, her name lived on. Historians wrote volumes on her reign, charting its arc from fragile youth to formidable matriarch. Poets captured her grief, her duty, her mystique, and novelists, whether lauding or questioning the values of the age, set their stories against the tapestry of her reign. For even those who had never seen her face to face, Queen Victoria remained a symbol, a mother of empire, a widow of sorrow, a queen of iron will. Her children, once tiny presences at her knees, were now figures of state in their own right. Bertie ruled as Edward VII, his reign marked by elegance and diplomacy, a social contrast to his mother's austere style. His coronation, delayed by illness but finally held with pageantry in 1902, introduced a new tone to monarchy, one of celebration rather than solemnity, openness rather than seclusion. Yet even as the court grew brighter and more adorned, the shadow of Victoria's long tenure still stretched quietly behind him. Victoria's daughters, Helena, Louise, Beatrice, continued their charitable and cultural work, often invoking their mother's legacy to lend weight to their causes. Princess Alice's children, now grown, bore the tragic burden of dynastic ambition. One granddaughter, Alix of Hesse, now sat as Empress Alexandra beside Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, a role increasingly marred by political strife and mysticism. Another grandson, Wilhelm II of Germany, governed with the bombast and insecurity of one raised in awe of a grandmother whose discipline he had never fully understood. The dynastic web Victoria had so carefully woven now bore signs of strain. The marriages she had orchestrated, meant to unite the royal houses of Europe, became potential fault lines in an increasingly nationalistic world. The family she had once envisioned as a shield against war began, ironically, to lay the foundations for conflict. But within Britain, her memory remained warm. People remembered the Queen as one of them. Not distant, not gilded, but real. A woman who had suffered losses as they had, who had raised children, known disappointment, prayed in sorrow, and written her thoughts by candlelight. She had loved fiercely, mourned deeply, and ruled steadily. Her reign had seen the expansion of democracy, the rise of industry, the abolition of slavery in the empire, the growth of education, and the birth of a social conscience. Her imperfections were many, but her presence had always been steadfast. Even those who had challenged her policies came, in time, to admire her endurance. Republican voices quieted. Even Irish nationalists spoke of her with grudging respect. The very constancy of her reign had become a source of comfort, proof that even as the world changed, one figure could remain unmoved. In the countryside, old women still referred to her as our dear queen, and clergymen quoted her words in sermons. Young girls were named Victoria in her honour. Men who had served under her, soldiers of Crimea, India, Africa, wore her medals on faded uniforms each armistice day. And within the walls of Windsor and Osborne, her legacy was preserved not only in marble or manuscript, but in the simple things she had touched. Her writing desk, still scratched by decades of use. Her diaries, neatly bound and stored. The faded cushion where she had once rested her back. These were not museum pieces, but quiet relics of a life that had belonged to both palace and people. Even in architecture, her influence lingered. Victorian had become more than an era, it was now a style. Rows of red brick terraces, grand railway stations, public baths, libraries, and schoolhouses all bore the stamp of the Queen's age. They stood as everyday monuments to a time when progress and propriety walked hand in hand. And so, the era lived on, not in the ticking of clocks or the headlines of papers, but in the whispered stories shared over tea, the letters tucked in drawers, the names etched into stone. Victoria, who had once feared she would be forgotten, became one of the most remembered figures in the modern world. She had outlasted her critics, shaped a century, and given shape to the very idea of what it meant to reign. To imagine living Queen Victoria's life is to step into a corridor of contrasts, where joy and burden, power and loneliness, tradition and transformation weave themselves into the very thread of your soul. If you were she, your world would be both vast and confined, majestic and deeply human, public and achingly private. Beneath the crown, behind the heavy velvet curtains and gilded carriages, would beat the heart of a woman often unseen by her empire. A woman shaped by loss, duty, and enduring love. From the earliest breath of your reign, you would feel the press of responsibility on your shoulders. At just 18, the weight of history would settle over your narrow frame like a mantle too grand for its bearer. You would learn early that your smile could calm a parliament, your disapproval could send ministers scrambling, and your presence, graceful, resolute, was not just a formality, but a force. And yet, you would also feel how tightly watched, how strictly moulded, how utterly isolated your life would become. You would know loneliness intimately. Even surrounded by courtiers, family, or an empire's worth of subjects, solitude would linger like a shadow. You would understand what it means to be admired, but rarely understood, bowed to, but not embraced. As a child, you would have played under the constant supervision of the Kensington system, your every move curated, your world so small it fit within palace walls. And though the crown might grant you freedom, it would also build taller walls. But then, Albert. When he enters your life, it is not merely a marriage, it is an awakening. With him, you would find laughter again, music, shared, glances across candlelit rooms, long conversations in German, in philosophy, in the private language of hearts that truly recognize one another. You would feel, perhaps for the first time, fully seen, fully known, and through him, you would discover the warmth of family. One by one, children would fill your arms in your palace. You would cradle them, scold them, write about them endlessly in your diaries. You would feel pride and disappointment, especially in Bertie, who would never quite match Albert's expectations. Yet despite their flaws, your children would become your tether to life's small, sacred joys. But with joy comes loss. When Albert is taken from you, it would feel as if the sun had fallen from your sky. The grief would not be poetic. It would be consuming. You would wear black not as costume but as skin. You would withdraw, not because of disdain for the world, but because the world without him would feel unrecognizable. The halls of Buckingham would echo differently. Even laughter would feel like betrayal. And still, you would rise each day, sign papers, counsel ministers, smile through clenched sorrow. Because queens must not break, even when hearts do. Living her life, you would feel time differently. The world would shift around you. Trains would replace carriages. The telegraph would bring voices across oceans. Electricity would turn night into day. And yet, despite the marvels, you would often long for the gentler rhythms of the past. Handwritten letters, family walks, poetry by firelight. You would marvel at your grandchildren, scattered across Europe, shaping history with their alliances and rivalries. You would see the seeds you planted bloom and sometimes burn. You would feel misunderstood by the press, by politicians, sometimes by your own people. They would call you aloof, old-fashioned, even stubborn. And perhaps you would be all those things, but beneath the stiff bodice and carefully chosen words would still beat a heart that longed for peace, for beauty, for something as simple as a hand to hold. You would feel your age not just in your bones, but in your soul. You would outlive friends, family, even children. The world would begin to speak of the 20th century with awe, but to you, the best years would always be behind. The years of dancing with Albert, of tucking infants into bed, of dreaming aloud in private rooms. The Queen would become myth, but the woman, she would still be there. Writing, remembering, mourning. Yet for all the sorrow, you would also feel an astonishing pride. You would see the hospitals built in your name, the medals granted to soldiers, the girls in remote schools learning to read because a sovereign believed in their dignity. You would feel the swell of jubilee hymns rise around you, feel the weight of countless hands waving as your carriage passed, feel the whispered prayers from distant lands carried to your ears on the voices of priests, sailors, and schoolchildren. You would feel history gather around you, not as dust, but as light, and as your final days approached, you would not rage against the dying light. Instead, you would welcome it as an old friend. You would ask for a lock of Albert's hair to be placed in your hand. You would smile faintly at Beatrice's voice. You would close your eyes, not in fear, but in memory, knowing that yours had been a life deeply lived, endlessly recorded, fiercely endured. To live her life would be to walk a road no one else had ever walked. At once intimate and imperial, beautiful and burdened, you would know the longing for ordinary things, a morning stroll unobserved, a quiet laugh without notation, a love untempered by duty. And yet, you would accept every step as your own. For in that acceptance, in that persistence, in that unwavering sense of self, you would become not just Queen Victoria, but history's Victoria. The life of Queen Victoria did not conclude with the silence of her final breath. It continued, transformed, through time, as a living thread in the fabric of modern history. Her legacy was not buried with her at Frogmore, but rather released into the world, rippling outward through generations, institutions, monuments, and memories. To live her life would be to leave a legacy not only measured in statutes and political milestones, but in the quiet ways the world remembers. And make no mistake, the world does remember. Victoria's name is etched onto more maps than any other monarch in history. Her legacy adorns oceans and harbours, mountains and plains, universities and capitals. There is Victoria Falls, thundering, over the border of Zimbabwe and Zambia, named by an explorer who wished to honour Her Majesty's grandeur. There is Victoria, British Columbia, a city shaped in her image. There are towns and states, lakes and rail lines, theatres and hospitals, all bearing the signature of her reign. But her legacy is not geography alone. It pulses through the very structure of modern monarchy. When Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, The British monarchy teetered between reverence and irrelevance. Her predecessors had left a public weary of scandal and disengagement. But Victoria, by embracing moral dignity and domestic virtue, reshaped the throne into something stable, personal, and enduring. She became not only the head of state, but the face of a national family, mother, widow, matriarch. In doing so, she transitioned the monarchy from the muscular, war-led image of kings past to a quiet, dignified presence that stood apart from politics, but remained deeply symbolic of continuity. Constitutionally, her reign ushered in the modern role of a monarch as a ceremonial figure, respected, consulted, but no longer absolute. Though not a revolutionary, she presided over the peaceful shift toward democratic governance with grace. Her prime ministers, Disraeli, Gladstone, Peel, Salisbury, came and went, but she endured, the one unchanging figure above the swirl of party and power. This legacy of steady symbolic leadership remains at the heart of Britain's constitutional monarchy to this day, and there is more. Her influence on culture and society, though often subtle, is profound. The image of the ideal family, cherished in Western thought, owes much to the royal domesticity Victoria and Albert projected. They made family life fashionable. Their portraits with children clustered around hearths and pianos reshaped the idea of royalty into something familiar, relatable, even enviable. The wedding customs she helped pioneer became cultural bedrock. She chose to wear white at her wedding, not for wealth or extravagance, but for purity and sentiment. That choice set a precedent. Today, brides across the world wear white because Victoria did so, over 180 years ago. The Christmas tree, the ideal of public mourning, even the Queen's Jubilee celebrations, each traces its tradition to her quiet decisions and enduring influence, and her family, a dynasty planted like seeds across Europe. Her children married into nearly every royal house of the continent. Through these alliances, she earned the moniker Grandmother of Europe. Her blood flowed through the veins of kings, emperors, and czars. Wilhelm II of Germany, Nicholas II of Russia, George V of Britain, three monarchs who would find themselves on opposite sides of World War I, were all her grandchildren. Some saw this as a triumph of diplomacy. Others would view it, in hindsight, as a tragic web. Regardless, it proved that her legacy was not confined to Britain. It was intercontinental. Her memorials stretch even further. There is the Victoria Memorial outside Buckingham Palace, glistening, white and crowned with a golden angel. There is the Royal Albert Hall, conceived in mourning, built in tribute. The Victoria and Albert Museum, that great temple to art and design, houses treasures of empire, industry, and inspiration. Even the very architecture of the age is called by her name, Victorian, from red brick terraces to railway viaducts, from grand libraries to gaslit theatres. And then there are her words. Through her diaries, voluminous, raw, and rich, we glimpse not just the monarch, but the woman. They show a queen who grieved deeply, who loved fully, who wrote of her body's pains and her soul's loneliness. They reveal someone who, despite all grandeur, suffered and served with equal devotion. These writings, more than any edict or speech, grant her immortality. They remind us that she lived not as an abstract symbol, but as a human soul who bore the impossible and kept walking. They teach us that legacy is not built only in great declarations, but in the daily act of showing up, of listening, ruling, grieving, enduring. And if you, dear listener, had lived her life, if you had carried the crown, buried the love of your life, outlived your children, witnessed the birth of a modern world, you would understand legacy differently. You would know that to leave a mark is not only to wield power, it is to love deeply, to persist humbly, to believe, fiercely, that your life might become something larger than itself. And indeed, Victoria's did. Her death may have closed a chapter, but her story continued. In every girl named after her, in every page turned in her diaries, in every quiet figure who watches, endures, and keeps the light alive. To live as Queen Victoria is to know that while time will dim memory, true legacy lives in the echoes, long after the crown has been laid aside